Hello and welcome to Suzi's Book Bag, hosted by me, Suzi Fay. If you've got sharp eyes, you've probably seen that what I've got up there is not even a book bag. It's a Sainsbury's wine bag, but it does have dancing corkscrews over it, which is very appropriate for the person that I'm going to be interviewing today. He's a wine blogger, a wine columnist. He's worked in the world of wine, but he's also worked in the world of books. And his wonderful book, Empire of Booze, is now back in print by considerable demand. Fans have been asking for it. It's been out of print for a while. So it's great that it's back, and it's great that Henry Jeffries is here to talk to me about it. So welcome, Henry. Welcome to the book bag.
Okay, good. Well, I'm delighted to be here in quadraphonic sound.
Wonderful. So Empire of Booze, this is my copy. And when I dug it out, I was pleased to see, or interested to see, you've actually signed it. And it says, "We Happy Few, paperback launch night, 31st of May, 18, 5 years ago. Thank you for coming." Yeah. Henry, God. I don't remember where the launch was. Where was it?
It was at the bookshop that pretends it isn't Waterstones in Blackheath.
Oh,
there's that little bookshop, and it's like, not a Waterstones, but it is actually a Waterstones, yes. But it's one of those sort of, they have them in like Rye and Southwold and stuff, where the people are too posh for Waterstones, so they pretend that it's an independent bookshop.
I remember it now. We were all downstairs, weren't we? Down that little staircase. We were in the bottom. So, so happy memories. Slightly blurred memories, of course. I can't remember what was served that night. Something suitably alcoholic.
Gin. I was getting through all my samples of gin. Yeah, we drank a lot of gin that night. I think we went out for drinks afterwards, didn't we? Didn't we go for?
I have a feeling we went for a pizza.
I can't remember where we went, but we definitely went out afterwards.
Yeah, I
went
think
to Pizza Bianco.
That's right. Yes. So anyway, nice to relive all of that and reread Empire of Booze, which I thoroughly enjoyed first time round. British history through the bottom of a glass. Now, I've been especially excited to do this because I have got a bottle of something to drink. So you recommended something for me to drink, and I bought the wrong thing. So what I've got is this Tesco Finest Pedro Jimenez sherry, and it didn't really say much about it, so I'm going to taste it now. Oh, it's very
beautiful pronunciation there.
Is that good? Yes, I wasn't sure. It's very dark, very, very dark.
It's sort of like if sherry made treacle, then that because what you were meant to get was Tesco's Finest Fino, which is made by the people who make Tio Pepe. So that's probably quite sweet, isn't it?
I'll try it now.
Can you feel the sugar rush?
Oh my god! Oh my god! That really.
Well, I'm going to have a glass of beautifully crisp.
Oh god! Oh, I think that might be too sweet even for my mum.
It's you sip slowly. It's very nice with blue cheese actually. So if you've got like a piece of.
It needs something umami-esque with it.
You probably want a little. Yeah.
Okay, right. Yes. I'll put that down hastily. I might probably have finished it by the time we wind up. But so Empire of Booze, it is about the effect of this thirsty nation on drinks that are famous all over the world. Our British palate and our British marketing skills have literally changed the face of booze, haven't they?
They have, yes, yeah. And I think it's the marketing skills that are often more important than the actual drinks themselves. I met this this producer in Sicily, and he was saying that the British were experts in the market. The Sicilians, we were sleeping. So there was a Sicilian wine that became Marsala, and the British just tasted it, or this British merchant tasted it and thought, pound signs appeared, kind of ka-ching, 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 and they knew how to sell it. And I think that's the sort of crux of the story. It's about merchants, capitalism, commercialization, rather than necessarily British people actually making anything.
But British tastes do tend towards the sweet and sticky in some cases, don't they? I mean, I was interested to read that port was apparently vile stuff before Brits got their hands on it.
Yeah, I mean, port didn't really exist. Port just meant that it came from Porto. It was shipped from the city of Porto in northern Portugal. So kind of anything that was red that came from northern Portugal was sold as port. And for a long time, it was probably not very good. And it wasn't, the heavy, sweet, alcoholic wine that we know and love today. It would have been stuff from cooler climates around the city, not dissimilar to Vino Verde, actually, quite a light, acidic wine, which would have been very nice for local consumption. But as soon as you put it in a cask and ship it for a few weeks until it reaches England, it probably wouldn't taste quite as good. So the sort of the port thing was about discovering where the better wines came from, and then shipping them downriver from the Douro Valley, which is much hotter. The climate in Porto is a bit like San Francisco. If you've ever been to San Francisco, it's cloudy and not sort of rainy and not particularly warm, and it's not very good for making strong sweet wine. But you go on the other side of the mountains, the Douro Valley, and you've got this baking hot place that's very good for growing very, very sweet grapes. So it was a question of merchants, first of all, shipping the wine to England, and everyone going, this is revolting, I much prefer claret. But problem was we were at war with the French, so there were lots of taxes on claret. It was very hard to get hold of. I mean, the whole kind of premises of the book is about the British love of French wine, but their inability not to be at war with the French. So it's about looking for claret substitutes, and one of them was port. But to begin with, they weren't very good, and then eventually they found these better wines, and something very slowly evolved. For a lot of the time, port would have been a dry wine. It would have been the stuff from up country. Would have been, if it had been fermented to dryness, 15-16% alcohol. They might have added brandy. They might not have added brandy. But gradually, a formula developed where you would get the grapes, you'd try and get as much flavor out of them as quickly as possible, which was people standing on them and dancing on them and things like that. Then while it was still full of sugar, they would add lots of aguardiente, which is grape brandy. It would kill the yeast, stop fermentation. You'd end up with a wine 18 to 20% that was still stuffed full of sugar, and that's sort of how port came about. But it was a gradual process. It went from probably a dry wine to a very sweet wine, but it took a long time. And there were still people in the 19th century. There was a port shipper called Baron Forrester who was complaining about the barbaric habit of adding aguardiente while it was still fermenting. So he was like a port purist and was saying, no, none of these trendy new sweet wines. It's all about the the proper dry wine. He was like a sort of port hipster, if you will, which is a sort of a kind of another theme with English wine, because you've got your very, very sweet sherry, and I've got my hipster sherry, my Tio Pepe, which is very, very dry. But for the English market, they would mix the two together. So they would, people would try this and they'd be like, oh, it's a bit too dry. So they would take dry sherry and mix it with sweet sherry to create what we think of as kind of, Vickers and Granny's sherry. But it was designed for the English market. But there were always people who said, this isn't the real stuff. What you want is this.
So did the sweet, strong stuff, was it drunk locally, or was it really all shipped off and sent back to England? Because how wines travel and spirits travel and the temperatures that they're kept in matters a lot as well, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think most of the strong wines, I mean, port was almost all for export until quite recently. It was all shipped off to Northern Europe because, you know, if you're in a hot climate like Portugal, you probably don't want a 20% sweet wine to sip in August. Whereas if you're in England and you haven't got central heating because it hasn't been invented yet, then port is the perfect drink. You know, it's bottled sunshine. It's a way of taking the heat of Southern Europe. Hang on, you seem to have disappeared. Oh, there you are. The heat of Southern Europe, putting it in a bottle and sending it to England or Ireland or, you know, Scandinavia or somewhere like that. So it's so what was drunk in these countries is often very, very different to what was exported. Just like with the sherry. So this is Fino. If you go to south of Spain, if you ask for sherry, this is what you get. If you're in England, until quite recently, if you ask for sherry, you'd get something a bit closer to what you've got.
You'd probably get Harvey's Bristol
the tastes
cream.
are very different. Well, I've actually got some Harvey's. Do you know, I should have brought that down. But Harvey's Bristol cream it's a blend of various dry, dark sherries with the good whack of what you've got, Pedro Jimenez. It's actually lovely. I mean, it's a much maligned drink, but Harvey's Bristol cream. There's a wonderful bit in Any Human Heart, you know, William Boyd, and it's the bit where he's on his uppers. You know, he's the old man. He hasn't got any money, so what he does is he goes to the pub and he has a half of lager and a schooner of Harvey's Bristol cream, and he says that it just warms you up, refreshes, and then he'd just sit all day until he got thrown out by the landlord for not spending enough money.
That's the other thing about these drinks, is that they're kind of mixed about and things are added, and I think sometimes you sort of assume that if things are added and blended, then that's a bad thing. It's kind of adulterating them. It's somehow cheating the person who's buying it, but it's always been done, hasn't it?
It has, yeah. I suppose it depends what you're adulterating it with. With Bordeaux, if you got good Bordeaux, it would be subjected to what's called hermitaging, which means putting some Hermitage, which is a strong wine from the northern Rhone, which is mainly Syrah, and they would put, you know, a few bottles of that in your barrel of Bordeaux, and it would beef it up a bit. But they also used to put some port in, or even brandy, or, you know, anything, Algerian plonk. They'd put it in to beef it up. But often, you know, and that was okay. You know, if you got some Hermitage in your claret, then I'm sure it would have been rather nice. But also they put things that weren't quite so good for you, like lead oxide. They put in it, which makes it taste sweeter. They put elderberries in, sloes, just sugar. You know, you put sugar in, all kinds of stuff because they could, but also they didn't have the sort of standards of cleanliness. Why wouldn't keep as well? You know, you didn't have sealed bottles. You'd have these casks, and when the cask was shipped, you know, it might be quite nice. And then if it had been open for a bit in, you know, in some tavern in Southwark, by about the time it's halfway down, it's probably, you know, it's not going to be quite as good. So they have these Cellarman's books of like how to perk up a dodgy barrel of sherry or something, and it's all like, you know, you add some saltpeter and some sloes and some elderberries and some lead oxide and a bottle of gin or something. So yeah, it kind of depends what the wine was adulterated with, but generally, apart from very few people like Thomas Jefferson, who was very into the purity of his wine, so he would always complain about the wine that he drank in London, that it wasn't as good as the wine that he was drinking in Bordeaux, where he was buying it directly from the chateau. Most people didn't really care, and they would actually, as long as it tasted good, they didn't really care if someone had put a bottle of brandy in it. In fact, they probably preferred it with a bottle of brandy in it. You just don't want the one with lead oxide in, because it'll kill you.
There's a chap who's pivotal to the story early on, who's Sir Kenelm Digby, and he's an example of the sort of science, isn't he, behind the British-led science behind drinking. So can you talk a bit about his great invention?
Yeah, Digby's a fascinating fellow. If you go to the National Portrait Gallery, there's a portrait of him by Van Dyck, and it's his wife, Lady Venetia Stanley, also by Van Dyck. And then he was accused of murdering her by giving her what's called viper wine. In fact, our mutual friend Hermione Eyre wrote a book about it called Viper Wine. But apparently he'd made some sort of youth serum from viper venom, which he gave to his wife, and it killed her. And so he didn't deliberately kill her. And apparently he was a very interesting fellow, because he was from that time where the kind of rules of science, the scientific method, hadn't really been worked out. So in some senses, he was a complete quack. He was a sort of alchemist, but he was also a proper scientist, and he was a member of the Royal Society, and he corresponded with Galileo and Isaac Newton and all these kind of people we think of as proper scientists. Digby was on that sort of, and I suppose Newton was an alchemist as well, wasn't he? So it was a very interesting time. And anyway, he was very into making cider. So he used to make, and this was at a time when, once again, problems with France, problems with the Dutch. It was getting hard to get French wine in England. And there was a movement that England would make its own wine out of apples. This diarist called John, and again, a sort of polymath, John Evelyn, came up with this book called Pomona, which was about how England would become self-sufficient in drink by utilizing apples rather than grapes. So Digby was one of these cider pioneers, where he was trying to make high quality, high strength sort of wine style cider. But he was also experimenting with glass. And at the time, glass would have been like this. It would have been quite delicate. And he was experimenting with coal-fired glass. And this is related to the fact that the trees, you weren't allowed to burn trees to make glass, because you needed them for the Royal Navy to make ships to fight the French. So it all kind of comes back to fighting the French. So they were using coal or anthracite or sort of stuff that came out of the ground. And the thing about that is you get a lot more heat from your poundage of coal than you do from your poundage of wood, which means that you can have better control over your ovens, the kilns where you're making the glass. And he came up with a technique where you would have different ovens. And apparently the strength of the glass comes from the annealing process. So the process where you cool it very, very gently. And if you're having an oven that's powered by wood, then you need a lot more wood to have a separate oven that's going to cool down very, very gently, if you see what I mean. Whereas with coal, you have a lot more control over the temperature. So Digby apparently invented this bottle. There's actually no direct evidence he did, but people said he did. So there was people tried to claim the patent, and they said that Digby invented this bottle. So we'll say he invented the bottle, and it was green, and it was much, much thicker and stronger than any glass that had been made previously. In fact, it was a lot like what we think of as a glass bottle now. It was very strong, and it completely transformed wine, because previously you'd ship wine in cask, and then you'd have the problem with what happens when you've drunk half of it, because the wine is going to start to spoil. Whereas with the bottle, you could ship it in bottle, and you've got, with a cork, you've got something that's sealed, and that will, so the drink inside will last, well, it'll last almost indefinitely. But he also was experimenting with fizz. So for a long time, it had been noticed that, especially the wine from Champagne, which is very cold climate, which at the time was not sparkling, it would be shipped to England in barrel in the winter after harvest. And then in England, in sort of March or April or May, as it warmed up, it would start fermenting again. And so you'd get carbon dioxide, and people would be like, wow, this is exciting. So that was the first sparkling champagne. It was wine that had stopped fermenting and then re-fermented in the spring. But Digby worked out that if you put that wine that was still fermenting in a bottle and corked it, you could control the fermentation. So you would have a wine that ideally, when you open the bottle, you would have a fizzy wine. And he wasn't the only one. There were all these scientists like John Beale, John Merritt, who gave papers to the Royal Society about how you control that fermentation in a bottle. And a lot of them were doing it with cider, and some of them were doing it with wine. And they discovered that if you added sugar to it while it was still fermenting, then you got more bubbles. And then you put a cork in, and then sort of tie the cork on so it didn't come out, and then leave it for a few months, and you would have a sort of proto champagne. So you couldn't do that with with an old glass bottle, because the pressure would just shatter it. But with these new strong bottles, you could control fermentation, and so you were having drinks that were forerunners of modern champagne, though the champagne process is a bit more involved now. So without Digby's invention, you wouldn't have sparkling wine, but also you wouldn't have, you go to Tesco and they have 800 bottles of wine. You wouldn't have that. You couldn't have that because there'd be no way of storing them. So instead you'd go to a tavern and they would have like sherry, port, claret, and you turn up with your jug. So basically the kind of modern wine trade as we know it owes everything to Digby's invention. I hope that wasn't too long.
Not at all. I mean, have the perfidious French ever credited the British invention with the entire champagne industry? Or
no. Funnily enough, they haven't. No. In fact, they made up a story. There was a French, God, I can't remember his name now, but he made up the story that it was Dom Perignon who invented it. I mean, there's no evidence at all that Dom Perignon invented it. In fact, it was more likely that he was working in the late 17th and early 18th century, and the strong glass bottle probably didn't cross the channel until the 1730s. And it's almost certain that in his writing, bubbles would have been a fault. So if your wine started re-fermenting, that would have been a fault, because he was trying to make still wines, not sparkling wines. So it took a long time for the technology, first of all, to cross the channel, but then you have to give credit to the French. They did turn what was a sort of cottage industry, an amateur affair, into a worldwide industry. So people like Louis Pasteur and Veuve Clicquot, they turned a rough process into something. They perfected it. So, I mean, I'm not going to claim the English invented champagne, but we definitely put in a lot of the groundwork.
For this book, and indeed for your wider career in wine, I mean, you must have done lots of travelling. So, I mean, presumably you went to Porto, Champagne. I mean, have you been to Australia and?
No, I mean, like that? I mean, the problem is that my career as a drinks writer took off at the time when I was starting a family. So it just didn't seem very fair to go to Australia or Chile or Argentina on a press trip when there was a small child at home. In fact, when I was in Porto for the first time, our youngest daughter was suffering from chicken pox. So it was sort of, it was not very politic, me disappearing for long periods of time. So though there is stuff about Australia and South Africa and stuff in the book, I've tried, and Jamaica, obviously, and Barbados and stuff, because there's lots about rum. Most of it is European, but I visited everywhere I could in Europe, but just the longer trips, they weren't feasible, sadly.
I did actually go to the Appleton rum distillery in Jamaica, and again that was on a press trip.
Oh, lucky you.
Oh yes, it was absolutely fantastic. I mean, going into the room that has, well, the big kind of barn that has all the, would it be the stills, or I mean, I don't know the terminology, but I mean, the smell was just fantastic. You know, you could smell the rum maturing in the casks. And then we went, they have their little distillery shop, and they gave us about, I want to say at least 8 things to taste, little tots, going all the way up to the most expensive. And I think the most expensive, all of us on the trip said, oh, we'll buy a bottle of that, and we don't mind how much it is. It's absolutely sensational. We must have it. And then they just sort of turned around and went, that's not for sale. You can't buy that at all. So you had to buy one about 3 down the line, which was still wonderful. I still got a great bottle of rum out of it, but I could never work out whether they kept it for themselves or it really was too expensive or they'd run out. But just one taste was pretty ambrosial.
Yeah. No, they do some sensational rums. I've got a couple of quite sensational ones which I haven't tried yet. That's Appleton Estate. So single cask from 1984. Should be quite nice. Haven't had a chance to try that yet. But yeah, Appleton Estate is sort of, it's the sort of Dom Perignon, if you will, of rum. It's the sort of pinnacle of rum. So I'm very jealous that because they don't often have press trips to Appleton Estate. You must have been on the premier list.
Yes, I mean, it was a strange mixture of sort of fine dinners. I think we climbed up a waterfall at one point and swam with dolphins. So a bit of everything, really. And we also went to...
Right. Oh, it sounds great. God, lucky you.
I know. I think it was a sort of highlights of Jamaica. But that definitely was a highlight. I seem to remember it was quite a long journey in a bus to get there in a little coach. It's pretty remote, the Appleton's distillery, and very old. I mean, the buildings all seemed quite old. Not very modernized, but absolutely amazing rum. So is the British love of Burgundy, have I got that right? Burgundy, is it anything to do with the fact that half of France was English for centuries? We actually, or the medieval kings were also kings of large chunks of France. I just wondered if that helped our taste for wine.
Yes. Well, I think you're probably thinking of Bordeaux rather than Burgundy, because Burgundy is right on the other side. There are some interesting links, but Bordeaux was the big one because it was Eleanor of Aquitaine when she married Henry II. Eleanor of Aquitaine. So Aquitaine, which is the the old Roman province, Aquitania, basically southwest France, all the area southwest of Gascony, really, became under the English crown, and a huge amount of claret, as it was known. Claret comes from claret, which means a sort of pale red wine, was shipped to England. Just a sort of unbelievable amounts. I think I've got some stats somewhere, but I don't have them off the top of my head. But it was like millions and millions of gallons were shipped over, and it was quite ordinary wine. We think of Bordeaux as quite prestigious wine now, but this would have been stuff that would have been shipped over and then drunk as quickly as possible before it turned to vinegar. And it's one of the reasons why I'm researching a book about English wine at the moment, where I've written it. And one of the reasons why English wine never took off, despite the fact that the climate was quite warm in the early medieval period, and there were vineyards all over southern England, sort of Hampshire and Kent and places like that. The main reason they never took off is because all this cheap wine was coming in from France, and the English native product just couldn't compete. And then when was the Battle of Castillon? Was that 1453? And that's when the English were finally, they kind of gave up and were like, we're never going to conquer this huge country next door to us. And I think the wine for a long time still kept on going, but it was But then you had a state of almost permanent war with France in the sort of 16th and 17th century. So they had to find an alternative. But what's quite interesting is that so the wine that came from France was generally, cheap stuff. It was stuff that everyone drank. But when Bordeaux's largest market was cut off, I mean, what's interesting about Bordeaux is that Bordeaux was not really drunk by the French, or was certainly not drunk by Parisians, because the Parisians drank champagne and Burgundy. Whereas Bordeaux, if you think of a map of France, you've got Bordeaux down there and Paris there. There's no way really to get the wine to Paris apart from overland, and the roads were absolutely terrible. So it was much, much easier to ship wine to London or Dublin or Leith or, anywhere else than it was to get it to Paris. So Bordeaux was a sort of, even after the English lost it, it was still a kind of North European enclave where you had merchants from Germany, Ireland, England, Scandinavia, Holland, those sort of places, Belgium, who would ship the wine. But the wine changed. So rather than being this cheap plonk, this new kind of wine was invented by a French lord called Arnaud de Pontac. And he invented the wine that became known as Haut-Brion, which Pepys tried and pronounced on its peculiar taste. And this would have been made by picking the ripest grapes rather than just throwing everything in, making sure they were all red grapes rather than just chucking in anything you could find, and just being really, really careful how you fermented it so that you got as much color and alcohol as possible, and then keeping it in new casks or newer casks so you didn't get any off notes and stuff. And it sold for a sort of 2 or 3 times the price of ordinary Bordeaux. And he set up his own shop in the city, the sign of the Pontac's head, which became the sort of coolest bar in town. And that's where Pepys went, and John Evelyn, and, all these sort of people. And it was the thing to do. You tried this new style of Bordeaux, which was Haut-Brion or O'Brien, or, they came up with all kinds of Oberon, sort of mispronunciations of it. And where Haut-Brion led, you got Lafite, Latour, Margaux, all these estates, and they were all designed to sell wine mainly to London or to other North European places. So all these wines, they were export wines. They weren't drunk by the French. The French drank local wine. They didn't drink Bordeaux. So that's the sort of the story of the British market, the influence that all that money just sitting on the other side of the channel had on French wine. And it's a similar story that's kind of repeated all over the world. You just have this kind of pull of money changing the local wine and making something that was just for export, that wasn't drunk by the locals.
What's the wine that's mentioned most often in Shakespeare? Is that sack?
That's sack, yes, which
sherry,
basically be sherry. But you also had Canary sack, which came from the Canary Islands. But it generally would have been a sort of strong, sweet wine that came from southern Spain.
Is there any point in trying to be historically accurate in terms of the taste of things, or is that now too difficult if things just change so much?
It's very hard to know what it would have tasted like. It almost certainly would not have been much like modern sherry, because modern sherry is aged for a long time. So the taste is, I think sack probably would have been a strong wine that would have been sweetened with something a bit like your PX. So that would have been similar. The taste of your PX may well have been in some ways similar. A strong wine sweetened, because yours is made from dried grapes, Pedro Jimenez grapes, which are laid out in the sun,
raisiny.
So they raisin a bit. Yeah, exactly. And so it probably would have been a young wine sweetened with something like PX, and then shipped over to England as soon as possible and drunk as soon as possible. So it wouldn't have been aged. So I suppose if you got like a very young, fresh sherry, modern day sherry, I mean, the grape varieties were different as well. So it would be almost impossible to recreate. But think of like a very young sherry with loads of PX in, that may well have been a bit like what sack would have tasted like, but it's hard to know.
And
but the mentions of sack in Shakespeare is just, it's almost like he's working for the Sherry Marketing Board. It's mentioned far more than ale or beer or anything else. It's sack.
Maybe it's what they served at the bar at the Globe. So
yeah,
but
I think it was a very popular drink. It was, it wasn't just for toffs. It would have been available everywhere.
Lots of the chapters of the book did make me want to start sampling and drinking things, and actually the cider chapter is a case in point, because I've never really liked cider, but from the description of some of the people making cider with a Y seems to be the kind of artisan product. Is that right?
Yeah, the cider that was sold to compete with wine would have been spelt with a Y, and then cider that wasn't so good. So you would have cider with a Y. Though I don't know how this worked in a bar or a pub in an essentially illiterate culture. So you'd just be, I'll have a cider, and they'd be like, is that a cider with a Y or an I? I don't know. I can't read. But then there was cider with an I, which was made from the leftovers from cider with a Y, and they would add water and re-ferment them to make a sort of low alcohol, sort of small, like a small beer, which was made from leftovers of production of big beer. You'd have a small cider that was what was drunk by the farm labourers. But the cider with a Y would have been made to be like like wine. So it would have been the best quality apples, fermented to 9, 10, 11%, often put in strong bottles, corked, and until you got a fizz absorbed into it. It's one of the great kind of what ifs of English history or sort of booze history, is what if these strong ciders had taken off? What if rather than the English then importing port or champagne or something, these ciders became as prestigious and as well marketed as champagne? Is there a sort of parallel universe where Somerset is like champagne, or Shepton Mallet is Epinay? I mean, it's not,
and full of castles and
chateaus.
Yeah,
exactly, like fairy tale chateau in Shepton Mallet. It could have happened, and there's sort of the reasons why it didn't happen. I mean, they're quite complicated, but I think the main reason is that a load of drinks arrived in England that were much stronger. So you began so the 17th century, when they were making these wonderful ciders, you started getting port coming in, you started getting gin, whiskey was being developed. So these very strong drinks, I think, pushed out the more delicate drinks of Shepton Mallet and places like that. And I think there's a big snobbery thing as well, in that it was considered much classier to be drinking something sparkling from France than something sparkling from Somerset. But it's a fascinating one, and they've started reviving them. So you now get champagne style ciders made all over the West Country, and also there's some in Kent where I live that are just absolutely gorgeous, and you try them and they're delicate, beautiful flavors, and you think, this should be better known. These should be marketed better. We should be drinking those instead of Prosecco or Cava. So yeah, one for the future. I think the person who manages to take those kind of wonderful flavors and then market them as well as champagne, then they're onto a winner.
What do you need to get on side for that to happen? Is it the hipsters or the aristocracy? Probably influencers nowadays. They need to get influencers to open bottles and say how delicious they are, I suppose.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, if like King Charles,
are there wine influencers?
They're very much our wine influencers.
Oh.
Yeah.
Are you one of them?
What?
Are you one of them?
I know I'm too old and male to be a wine influencer. You
Oh.
have to be beautiful and female to be a successful wine influencer. No one's very interested in seeing me opening a bottle of rosé and kind of reclining in my amazing lifestyle, perhaps with my dog. Yeah, I know. I tried to become an influencer once, but yeah, it didn't really work. People weren't influenced. But if King Charles, like his next banquet, if he served Sussex sparkling cider, that would get people talking. That would something like that, I think, would be a huge shot in the arm for the English cider industry. But I'm going to a tasting soon that's organised by a cider importer, not importer, because you're already here. Agent, distributor, I don't know. He's organising one, which I'm going to write about for someone. But I'm very excited about it. So watch this space.
Many years ago, pre-journalism, this is, or when I was just starting in journalism, I still did temping jobs. And probably the best job ever was at a wine merchant's. Again, I don't know what you'd call him. It was under the arches near Battersea. And yeah, it was just a place absolutely stacked high with wine, and everybody just sort of began drinking at about 11 a.m. and somebody would, put a glass on top of, I had one of those huge old electric typewriters, like a kind of tank. And I seemed to spend most of my day sending letters to people apologizing that they hadn't quite got all the wine that they ordered because we drunk some of it. But the rest was on its way. It was incredibly jolly, and they had a wine tasting at somewhere called the Turf Club, I seem to recall.
Oh yeah, I know the Turf Club, yeah.
And I had to sort of stand at the door and take everybody's name, which was a bit of a boring job, but again, somebody would come out and just keep giving me glasses of champagne. And I remember then, it was sort of earls and there was somebody. I think it was somebody who was just called Aaron, and I said, "Could you put your address?" And I'm pretty sure he said something like, "Well, I'm the Earl of Arran, and I live I live in a castle with the same name."
Earl of Arran,
yeah.
Scotland.
Yeah, there were all these people just putting one word down as their name and address. But yeah, like I say, it's probably the best temp job I ever had. I would have longed to go back, and that would be an alternate universe, you see. If the person I was filling in for never came back, I probably would be big in the world of wine shipping now. You never know. Or possibly dead.
Oh, right. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of that about. Yeah.
You've worked in Oddbins, haven't you? I'm going to have a bit more of this. That went down rather well. Tell me about Oddbins. You did
when I went to Oddbins, the manager of the Leeds shop where I started, he'd be like, Jeffries, I think it's time if we had a little sharpener. And a little sharpener meant a glass of dry sherry, normally Tio Pepe, at 11 o'clock. So you'd get in the morning, and the manager would be, hung over to shit, and you'd just be like, grumpy and stuff. And then you'd be like, I think it's time we had a little sharpener, isn't it, Jeffries? And then we'd do that, and it was a lot of fun, actually. I must say, I was in Leeds, and it was a very fun time to be in Leeds. There was a lot of stuff going on. There was nightclubs and bars and stuff, but also Leeds has a very big sort of city to it. City as in sort of financial world, but lawyers and stuff like that. So you can actually sell a lot of quite upmarket wine because there's people who'll buy it. So you combine that with the fact that it had a brilliant nightlife. It was a great place to be a wine merchant. You'd often, you'd have turned up to a bar with your little trolley delivering them their, night supply of booze, and then a bit later you'd be in the bar and they would be giving it to you for free. So it was a very happy time, actually. I think late 90s, early noughties, working for Obbins in Leeds. But
Did you
like
learn
you,
a
I'm
lot?
kind of glad I didn't stay. I learned a hell of a lot, yeah, because as well as being a bunch of drunks, they were very, very knowledgeable. So I learned in 2 years working at Obbins, I learned more about wine, I think, than I've done. I've never done any formal studying. It's basically just picking it up from listening to people who know a lot more than me.
When did you start writing about wine?
A brilliant job. Sorry, say that again.
When did you start writing about wine?
In 2010, 2011, I started a blog about wine, mainly because I just had all this stuff in my head about wine. I was reading a lot about it. I was going to lots of wine tastings, and I thought, ones that I'd pay for as a member of the public. And I was just sort of, I had these thoughts that I wanted to get out. So I started doing this blog, and the idea was that it would be kind of humorous. It wouldn't just be like, oh, this smells of lavender, this one's got oak in it. It would be sort of culture and stuff. And I was quite friendly with Craig Brown, the humorist. And I was telling him about my blog, and he read it and thought it was quite funny. And he sent it to Rachel Johnson, who at the time, the sister of our former Prime Minister, and she was editing The Lady at the time. And she phoned me up and said, I'm looking for a wine columnist. Can you come in and meet me? And I went up to her office at the Lady House in Bedford Street in Covent Garden. And she was in a huge office. And she goes, we're looking for a new features editor. Do you want to be our new features editor? And I said, I don't know anything about features. And she goes, no, I don't know anything about running a magazine. And then she goes, okay, how about being a wine writer? And I said, okay, I know a bit about wine. Let's do that. And so she gave me a job writing for The Lady, which I did for about 5 years, writing a weekly column about wine, which, at the time when I started it, I actually didn't know very much and was definitely not qualified to write a wine column. But it was a fun experience and a good introduction to journalism.
And a good introduction to the journalistic art of the freebie, I imagine. Were you pelted with bottles as a result of this?
I was. I mean, if you could probably see my room here, I've just got hundreds of bottles. And the thing is, the fun of getting free drink, I was going to say it never wears off, but it actually does wear off. And after a while, you're just like, oh, I've only got so much space. Please stop sending me things. But for a long time, it was wonderful. Just, wine would turn up, often unannounced. No one would tell you. They just go. But sometimes people would send you like ridiculous things, like a £500 bottle of tequila, without any kind of, they wouldn't tell you they were doing it, and they never followed up. So you'd just be like, okay, well, I suppose we better drink it then. So it's a strange world, the drinks industry.
What's the most expensive wine you've ever drunk, and what were the circumstances?
I went to a charity dinner, and I had a bottle of Richebourg, Domaine de la Romani Conti, Richebourg 2005. I have no idea how much that is, but it's like tens of thousands of pounds. And that was very nice. Though I had to run off and get a train, so I only had a tiny bit. I think that's probably the most expensive wine I've ever had. I've had some very, very rare ones. Berry Brothers used to sell 19th century Madeira. They used to have it was on their regular list. And I've tried like 1867 Madeira. Actually, I've had some whiskies that are probably more expensive than the Richebourg. So I've had sort of old Macallans, which are £50,000 a bottle. So there, but whiskey is kind of silly money. So yeah, lots of things, but they're not really worth that much. I mean, they are worth that much money because someone's going to pay for them. But you're only going to be disappointed if you try a £40,000 bottle of whiskey. You can't ever try it and go. Whereas a sort of £200 bottle of Madeira, you're only going to be absolutely blown away because you get some incredible ones for. I mean, that's a hell of a lot of money for most people, but not compared with £40,000.
Do you have to have a particularly fine palate? I mean, I always worry that I can't really taste as much as a wine expert. I do have a friend who was studying for Master of Wine, and she said it's like anything, you train your palate.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's also to do with it's to do with approaching things in a systematic way and having a really good memory, so that you kind of go, you try a wine, you smell it, you think I get something like that, and then you remember that, and then the next time you try a similar one, then you pick up something a bit similar, and you trade. Oz Clarke writes really, really well about it, how he trained his brain, and after a while, you do, it's not all bullshit when people are talking about orange blossom. Sometimes you really does smell like orange blossom, but you have to kind of think about it systematically before. So the first time you smell a wine that might smell of orange blossom, you'll be like, oh, it smells vaguely floral, and then you kind of narrow in and you're like, but is it like that? And I don't think I'm particularly good at it. I'm not Oz Clarke, who I think is brilliant at it, but it is something that can be taught. I think some people have a natural ability more than others, but it's definitely something you can learn.
Have you done blind tastings?
Yeah, I'm terrible at them. Yeah, I did a Oxford versus Cambridge blind wine tasting for The Spectator, so I had to write. I was taking part in it, and yeah, it's very, very hard because you've got nothing to go on. And my sort of thing was to try it and then make some huge leap of intuition, but that's not how you do it. You have to break it down. So go, well, it's got that, so it can't be that. It's got that, so it can't be that. So you do that. You got to show your workings. Like you're doing long division or something, and then you narrow it down through a process of elimination. That's how you do it. Whereas I would try a bit and go, oh, it reminds me a bit of that wine I had last week. I think it's this, and I'd always get it completely wrong. Actually, no, a few times I got it right. Like there's certain things like Riesling generally is quite distinctive. So you're like, that's definitely Riesling. I was like, where does it come from? And I got that one wrong, where it came from. But I got the grape. But it's tricky. Again, it's about training, and I haven't trained myself very well.
There was a famous blind tasting that you write about in Empire of Booze, where the up and coming Californians beat the venerable French. When was that? That sort of upset the grape cart.
That was the 24th of. Yeah, it was the 24th. I think it was the 24th of May. I know the exact date because I'm writing something about it at the moment. 1976. It was organised by a recently deceased English wine merchant called Stephen Spurrier. And I think it's quite hard to know whether he deliberately saw it as a piece of mischief, because originally he was just going to do a tasting of Californian wines, just to basically, because he ran a shop in Paris, basically as a publicity stunt to say, do you realize they make wine in California? And then he thought it would be more fun to try them against the French ones. And he got all these venerable French wine industry people who all treated it as a bit of a joke until the results were announced. And then it was like, a huge scandal. Yeah, exactly. Sacre bleu. And there was one like Odette Kahn, who edited the Revue de Vin. She never spoke to him again. To her, I think she died, but to her dying day, just said the whole thing had been a setup. It had been a scam, and that it was a sort of disgrace to the honor of France. But it's a very interesting one to ponder on what it means. They made it into a film, an awful film with Alan Rickman playing Stephen Spurrier. Alan Rickman was, and when he was acting like he was in Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, so just chewing the scenery, going the full Alan Rickman, playing this very, very diffident, buttoned-up Englishman. So if you knew Stephen Spurrier, and I knew him a tiny bit, it's a terrible film, worth watching. It's one of those films that's so bad it's actually very entertaining.
It's called not Bottle just Shop. For the Alan Rickman
worth checking out.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Who do you really admire apart from Oz Clarke in the world of wine writing? I mean, it strikes me, I teach reviewing, and I think restaurant reviewing is possibly the hardest, and wine writing, you know, book reviewing in a sense is easier because it already is a written artifact. I think it's hard to actually, some of the best writing in these terms is by a pair of people who wrote the perfume book, which is very similar to wine in a way. It's you know, smelling things and describing them in amazingly concrete language. Who does that well for wine? Are you thinking, or is there a
Victoria
delay?
Moore, who is the Telegraph wine Yeah, no, I got all that. Victoria Moore is really, really good. She writes the Telegraph at putting tastes and smells into words. She has a real gift for it. And when she describes a wine, I'm just like, you know, how did you do that? You've just brought it to life. I think she's very good. Andrew Jefford, who used to write for Waitrose magazine and now does stuff for Decanter, he's like the master in the trade. So if you ask anybody who writes about wine who the best is, everyone says Andrew Jefford. He's the sort of wine writer. And then there's a few writers who I've sort of, I wouldn't say modeled myself on, but I think I'm never going to be Andrew Jefford. So I try and write about people, you know, bring the personalities to life. And there's an American writer called Robert Camuto who writes about Italy and Sicily, places like that. And he's very good at bringing people to life. There was an English wine writer who hasn't written anything for years. He now runs a chain of falafel restaurants called Patrick Matthews, who wrote a book called The Wild Bunch in the 90s, which is, again, brilliant at bringing people to life. Kingsley Amis, you know, has written so entertainingly about drink over the years. He's another one that you just, you know, can learn a lot from. I will not actually learn a lot about drink because, but, you know, learn a lot about how to make a subject entertaining. I'm intrigued that you teach restaurant reviewing. That must be a really hard one. I bet you get some shockers.
Well, I mean, it's part of teaching sort of how to review anything, really. So we go through film and plays and books and kind of travel writing. It's not really reviewing, but different forms of journalism. And I think the funniest thing was somebody who went and reviewed a restaurant and the piece didn't actually mention the food. It said it was all about the ambience. It was kind of funny because it was sort of the decor, the ambience, the other people. It was a very lively piece of writing. And then it said something like the food arrived. It was very good. Anyway, the people on the next table.
That's brilliant. So that's the kind of restaurant reviewing I can get behind. I love it when they write about anything apart from the food.
Yeah. You know, I think it's very hard for that reason that you need to have eaten in restaurants a lot. I mean, you can really tell with the critics. I mean, they've often run restaurants or been in part of the business. Really good critics know where everything comes from and every single technique. It's not so much I'm out with my friends and the food was good. But yeah, I think it's hard, and I think it's hard to because restaurant critics should also review the wine, shouldn't they? And that's just a whole extra area of expertise.
Well, A.A. Gill didn't, did he? Because he was teetotal, so he never used to review the wine. He still managed it.
No, he was a good restaurant reviewer, wasn't he? Among other things, among many other things.
Yeah, well, A.A. Gill is, you know, he's someone who's I've never tried to deliberately write in a Gillian manner, but he's definitely an influence. I think you can't, you know, be a journalist brought up in the 90s and not, you know, be in some ways either by trying to not to do an A.A. Gill or by trying to kind of get elements in. But because when I started writing about drink, there was very few people writing about anything apart from what was in the glass. So everyone was like, ooh, you know, tannins and fruit and stuff. And there was very few people trying to do a sort of, you know, bring in the wider story, the people, the, you know, the controversy, the, you know, your own life. And there's now more people doing that. But so in some ways I was quite influenced by those kind of restaurant reviewers who would use the restaurant as a sort of jumping off point to talk about something else. And you know, that's something that Gill did very, very well.
Mm. Mm. And to go back to the historical side of things, I was in Gibraltar recently, and I got all the stories about Nelson's body arriving fresh from the Battle of Trafalgar. It docked in Gibraltar, and I think that's where they pickled him in rum for the journey back. I mean, rum is so much a part of the Navy, isn't it? So I think there's a detail in the book about what Navy strength is. That really ties in this empire theme of yours, doesn't it? That it is these wars and battles and victories and. I didn't finish that sentence.
The Navy strength thing is just a way of checking that the rum was strong enough. So they would add gunpowder to it, and if it didn't ignite, then you get some gunpowder, you put rum on it. If it didn't ignite, then the rum wasn't strong enough, and if it lit, then it was strong enough, which was proof. So that was called 100 proof, was when it lit, and then if it exploded, then it was too strong, but that was okay.
Is that where we get proof from, or was that already
100 proof? 100 proof is 57% ABV, and that was the strength. That was Navy strength. So that was the strength of. So if it was proof, then that was the right strength, and if it was under proof, then it wouldn't explode, and if it was over proof, then it was too strong. So proof is the.
And is it true that everybody was sort of given a tot a day?
Yeah, everyone was given a tot a day. Usually diluted. It would have been drunk always with water, but often with lime juice and stuff in a sort of proto mojito. You know, rum, lime juice, and you know, to prevent scurvy. So the world's first cocktail, perhaps, was the
that gives a very different view of the Navy, doesn't it? That they're all having mojitos. They're all sipping mojitos.
They're all sipping mojitos and getting down with the boys.
So you didn't go into cocktails. I mean, in Empire of Booze, there are sort of areas that you don't go into because they're just not part of the story. So Italian wines, largely German wines, with the exception of the Sicilian Marsala. Cocktails are not part of Empire of Booze, but are you doing a kind of follow-up?
Well, cocktails are American, so. Yeah, well, I was hoping for it because cocktails are American, so they were they come from. They're invented in America, and they depend on having large quantities of ice, which Americans had because they had the Great Lakes, and they would freeze and they would carve the ice out and they'd keep them underground, so you had ice all year round. So I was hoping that the book would be such a tremendous success that I would be asked to do a follow-up called Republics of Booze or Kingdoms of Booze or Khanates of Booze or something, but it never happened. So, you know, publishers, there's more books in me.
Yeah. But so the one that you've written, or it's not come out yet, is about English wine.
It's called Vines in a Cold Climate, which is a reference to Nancy Mitford, and it's about how English wine went from a joke to world class in 30 years. So it's the sort of the people behind the English wine revolution. It comes out on the 3rd of August. So I'm sort of it'd be interesting to see how it does. And
is that with Unbound as
well?
No,
that's with Allen and Unwin, Atlantic Books.
Oh, right. Okay. Oh, that'll be.
So it was their idea. They said, "Do you want to do a book about English wine?" And I said, "Okay."
Is it something to do with global warming? I mean, that's what people are talking about, aren't they? That there's more.
Yeah, I mean, global warming is a big part of it, but a lot of it is professionalism. So before, you'd have some retired colonel who would have some damp field, and he'd be like, I don't know what, I'll plant some vines there. And they'd plant some vines, and the wines would be horrible. And then you had people who were professionally trained, who found the right places with the right grape varieties, and they harvested them at the right time, and they made them in proper. So it's sort of, I'd say it's 2/3 money and ambition and professionalism, and 1/3 global warming. So that's the sort of the ratio. I think if the climate, even if the climate hadn't changed since the 80s, we'd still be making much better wine. But the climate changing has helped.
So I'm going to ask you for a recommendation or two. What, it can be quite broad, but what would be a good value wine to be drinking, or style of wine to be drinking at the moment?
English or anything?
Anything really,
because you don't get value in England. English wine is always expensive.
Right.
Oh, well, anything really. Well, I love Picpoul de Pinet. That's my favorite value good everyday wine, which is southern French white wine, and it's a very recent wine. It used to be all the grapes used to go into Noilly-Prat, the Vermouth. So it's down south of France, not far from Béziers, and you have these flats, and in the sea they have the oysters, and all the grapes used to go into Noilly-Prat, and Noilly-Prat doesn't sell as well as it used to, so they didn't know what to do with the grapes, and then they discovered that if you fermented them cold, using sort of quite technology, stainless steel, cool fermentation, you got these wonderful, characterful, crisp, dry wines. And I think they are absolutely wonderful. And, £7, £8, £9 a bottle. So I'm a big fan of Picpoul.
Have you got is there a particular supermarket that does a good Picpoul?
I think they're all pretty good. There's a few co-ops that make them, cooperatives, and they're pretty reliable, actually. Like I get the one from the Wine Society, which is made by, it's not a co-op, it's a private company, Féline Jourdan. But, they're kind of Cave de Florensac. I think they supply Tesco. I think that's very nice. They're all pretty tasty. You can't go wrong. Or the other one I drink a lot of is Vinho Verde from Portugal, and Aldi Vinho Verde, the kind of Aldi's finest, their kind of Premier League line of Vinho Verdes. Just absolutely incredible for about £7 a bottle. So those are our summer wines.
Yes. As the weather's now getting a bit better, so I think both of those would be perfect. I think there was a bit of a thing of getting into Picpoul in lockdown. It seemed to be discovered. Well, it was certainly discovered by me anyway. So I tried quite a lot of them and enjoyed them very much. So, I mean, in lockdown, did you find you were drinking more, drinking less? Lots of people drank more in lockdown.
Far more.
Right.
Yeah, I drank a lot. I got quite into cocktails and stuff, and also the sort of eating became a big thing because you couldn't go out. So we prepare these elaborate meals, and I'd get the right wine out to have with them and stuff. It got I'm glad those. I mean, it was nice drinking good booze, but it was I don't want to go back to those days.
No, hopefully we won't. Okay, well, I'm going to wrap up by asking 3 questions.
3 questions. 3 questions.
3 questions that I ask everybody at the, if I remember, that is. And I am remembering, so that's quite good. So the first question is: do you have a favourite artwork?
Oh, you see, I'm not very good with art. I like art. I tend to kind of I'm quite old fashioned in my tastes in art. So I had to really think about this one. And I just, I like to walk around the National Gallery and go, ooh, but I don't know anything about art. So I'm going to say, and it's probably going to put me down as like a terrible kind of normie, but that painting by Wright of Derby, the one with the bird in the pump kind of thing.
Oh yes, the air pump. He
vacuum
did
pump
science pictures, didn't he? He did pictures.
They're always on the cover of books about the Enlightenment, you know, where it's like, ooh, the light of knowledge, ooh, the darkness of mysticism around the outside.
It's always about light, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah. And I love a bit of Wright of Derby. Just anything by Wright of Derby, I'm kind of all over. Also, I'm massively into. I love Bruegel as well. You know, the one that the
Derby. Derby has a room.
I've been through Derby, but I've never. I imagine the Derby Art Gallery probably has quite a few Wrights of Derby.
It's worth stopping off. They've got a room of Wrights of Derby that are pretty fantastic. So yeah.
Love a bit of Bruegel, you know.
Bruegel.
I mean, the snow. Icarus,
they often look a bit drunk, kind of don't they? In Bruegel.
I went to the museum. What's that?
They often
they are quite drunk in Bruegel. Yeah, there's that. Yeah, there's that feast. There's the wedding feast one where they are actually really drunk and there's people falling over. You know, it's a kind of jolly sort of Flemish drunkenness, though, isn't it? Strong good ale.
And you were just going to say you went to a museum?
Oh yeah, just Musée des Beaux-Arts. I went a few years ago in Brussels, and it was just absolute heaven. You know, all those sort of Bruegels and, you know, Hieronymus Bosch, all that sort of stuff. You know, I don't really like anything too late. You know, anything kind of, even the 19th century is getting a bit too modern for me. I like a kind of Flemish master. That's my or, you know, Velasquez, you know, Spanish master. You know, any those kind of things.
It's got the one that Auden wrote about in the poem Musée des Beaux-Arts, which is the Icarus.
Icarus. Disappearing into water. Yeah, yeah. They knew about suffering, those old masters, or something like that.
Yes.
Musée des Beaux-Arts.
There's something about the horse scratching its innocent behind on the tree, and the ship, which must have seen something amazing, a boy falling out of the sky. Beautiful and then the end of it just but sailed calmly on. Amazing poem. Amazing poem. Yeah. Very good art gallery. It's a wonderful place. So that's art, and then the next one is what's a book that you should have read by now, and maybe you pretend that you've read but you haven't really.
Probably. I live in Kent, out in the marshes, sort of not really by the sea, but where the sort of it feels very, you know, there's a creek. I live in Faversham and there's a creek. So it feels very maritime, even though the sea's about 5 miles away. And I always describe it as being like Great Expectations, you know, you know, but I've never read Great Expectations. I'm basing it entirely on the David Lean film. So I'm Great Expectations, because I always reference it and always like talk about, you know, where I am is it's very sort of Dickens country, because you've got Broadstairs and Rochester, and you know it's one of the most Dickensian places in England, and I haven't read Great Expectations. So yeah, I should.
Are you planning to?
I am. Yeah, no, I'm definitely planning to. I've just got lots of books I need to read for work, but I think I definitely will get around to it. Maybe when I retire.
It's one of the shorter Dickens, so that's in its favour, I think. If you don't like long books, it's they just had an adaptation which I didn't watch any of, but so many people said it was unbelievably terrible that I think would stick to the David Lean film. I think that's probably much better.
David Lean one is it's wonderful. But my worry is that my expectations have been raised so greatly by the David Lean film that I actually read Great Expectations, and you know, maybe it's not as good as the film. Yeah,
quite not likely, but quite possibly. Yes, too great an expectation can be a bit of a problem. And then the last one. Have you ever had any very funny or very bizarre or weird feedback on your work? And if so, what would it be?
I was asked, and I'm still not quite sure why, to talk at a Seder supper organized by, they're not Hasidic, but they're a kind of similar sect. I can't remember what they're called. They're like a Lithuanian sect, a bit like the Hasids, but they're not Hasidic. But they're Seder supper in Oxford. And they invited me to talk. And I am partly Jewish. My father's Jewish, but I'm not in any way observant. And they invited me to talk about the book, about Empire of Booze. And I was talking about how the English, the British have this huge variety of drinks, not like the Russians that just have vodka. And there was this Russian woman there, and she was like, "That is not true. We drink Georgian wine. We drink fortified wine from Crimea." You know, she was just like, "We drink Armenian brandy. You know nothing about what Russians drink." And so I'm doing this most awful Russian accent, so please don't please don't cancel me or anything. But so she was very, she didn't like it at all, because I was stereotyping the Russians as just being vodka drinkers, when she said that the Russian drink a lot more interesting stuff. But it was a funny supper, because we started off on the kosher wine, which was horrible, and but it was all very observant and lots of Hebrew and stuff. And then they just put loads of bottles of Glenfiddich on the table, and everyone just got absolutely hammered. So it was quite fun.
So that's what goes down there then. Good choice.
Yeah,
Good choice, Glenfiddich. Okay. Well, I shall let you go and uncork a bottle. If that's what
I have to pick up
my
daughter from nursery, so this is perfect timing.
Right. Okay. So you're not going to drink before you go. But anyway, it's been lovely talking to you. No. So Empire of Booze is back. It is has been reprinted.
Back. Buy copies of it.
Buy lots
and buy
of
the
copies
next book as well.
We'll look forward to seeing the next one. Yeah, that sounds really fascinating. So thank you very much for joining me in the book bag. I shall say goodbye. And thank you very much for joining me and watching this episode. And now it's definitely time to raise a glass. Before you do it, if you haven't already, please hit the subscribe button and cheers. Cheers. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.